Well, the immediate response is shared by everyone. It was a horrible atrocity. Crime against humanity is not too strong a word for it. So shock and horror and outrage and these are the natural responses, and I share them, as does everyone. The further question is what you do about it. That's a different matter. And then you have choices. One way is to answer bin Laden's prayers and launch a massive assault against some Muslim population. That's precisely what they're asking for. And every intelligence expert and strategic analyst knows it and has been pointing it out over and over again. Just yesterday, the French foreign minister pointed out that a massive military assault against any Muslim population will be in, say, Afghanistan. To do that would be to fall into what he called a diabolical trap. And he knows exactly what he's talking about. France, and French intelligence particularly, was deeply involved, in fact played a primary role in drawing the Russians into what Zbigniew Brzezinski later called an Afghan trap, when Brzezinski took credit for the fact, maybe he's exaggerating, but he took National Security Advisor under Carter in a secret directive of 1979 which provided aid to Mujahideen fighting against the government in Afghanistan. And according to Brzezinski, the purpose was to incite a Russian invasion, which indeed took place a couple of months later and drew the Russians into this Afghan trap, which was a major factor leading to the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Brzezinski is very proud of that. The French were in the forefront of planning that, so when Védrine, Foreign Minister Védrine, talks about a diabolical trap, he knows exactly what he's talking about.
As disturbing as the idea of going to war, as disturbing as the idea of going to war against civilians, possibly, in this attempt to root out evildoers wherever they may be, I mean, that is chilling. But what we're also seeing that's really worrisome to me is politicians trying to push through really regressive measures, which, I mean, none other than Bob Barr, not a person I generally agree with, but even Congressman Bob Barr pointed out that some of these restrictions on civil liberties, this desire to hold immigrants without explaining why for indefinite periods of time, these are things that, racial profiling, these are policies that people had tried to push through before and were unsuccessful at getting through. And they're essentially using this moment of fear and confusion to push through some really restrictive and frightening measures which people wouldn't have accepted at any other time. And so that's really disturbing. Some of the things we're hearing, media are picking this up too. The New York Times had a column by Clyde Haberman which essentially said, racial profiling by the New York police, oh, we didn't think it was so good, but now, now this kind of proves that it's really necessary. The New York Times also had a news article in which they said, even black people are finding that they're doing racial profiling now too. We have to really be on the watch for media claiming to speak for us, the U.S. public, when they say people now think it's okay if immigrants are detained without explanation because that might protect us from terrorism. People now think it's okay if maybe journalists are restricted in their ability to do their job. Well, nobody I talk to really thinks that's okay. As much as people want us to figure out what led to these attacks, and as much as people want us to bring to justice the people responsible for these horrible, horrible attacks, nobody that I talk to, and that's really left or right, thinks that the United States should throw away all of its freedoms and its civil liberties in that effort. In fact, people believe that it's an opportunity for us to more carefully define what exactly we do value in terms of freedom of expression, in terms of freedom of assembly. We want to talk about those things, but no one I talk to is in the mood to throw that stuff out. In fact, we think, if we're defending anything, isn't it just those liberties?
I think progressive Americans have to raise the question, why are they so angry? Why would a handful of people using crude weapons deliberately killed themselves and hundreds of others, thousands of others, in these horrific acts of violence. None of this is to justify these crimes against humanity and the horrific acts that destroyed so many thousands of lives, but it is to place it in a context in which we can have a frank political discussion. The United States is a country that, even though we have rarely experienced this kind of the use of terror as an instrument of contestation, if not direct war, and people draw analogies between, or parallels between 9/11 and Pearl Harbor, even though one is a criminal act and the other was an act of war, an aggression by a state. I think it's important for us as Americans to think about terror as a two-way street. That is, the United States on 9/11 in 1973 engineered a coup against the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende that led to the deaths of thousands and thousands of Chileans, the abrogation of democracy in Chile, death camps, and many of those thousands will never be heard from again, and there was never any justice against the regime and the architect of that fascist dictatorship, Augusto Pinochet. So that the United States was the architect of all that. We created all of that. The same kind of support the United States had for Mobutu in Zaire. The same kind of support that we have had for right-wing regimes all over the world throughout the 20th century. And so our culpability in the use of terror transcends anybody else on the planet. The role of terror as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy is perhaps clearest and most fundamental over the last few years in the anti-apartheid struggle in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. That in Africa, the United States' policy was to deliberately support terror, the use of armed violence against civilian populations. That's what Renamo was in Mozambique. That's what UNITA was and is in Angola. That's what Inkatha, the Zulu right-wing force, was in the use of tools of violence against civilian populations who were loyal to the ANC, the African National Congress. So we first have to ask the question, what is the government's role in fostering terror? And that on a moral plane, Osama bin Laden and Henry Kissinger and Augusto Pinochet, there is no difference.
The media's job, I think, is to explain to the people of our country and to the young people about what an important document the Constitution is, what an extraordinary document it really is, having been written 200 years ago. And that freedom does not simply mean rallying oneself behind the flag here. This is a great flag. But freedom means allowing the kind of dissent and vigorous debate and tolerance of onerous points of view that people regard as obnoxious and hateful, because we understand that once you say, I don't want to hear that point of view, you can't say that, you begin to stifle all kinds of points of view. You begin to create a mindset which becomes unconscious in many ways. Oh, I don't want to sign the petition because I may get in trouble. I don't want to read that book because somebody may think something else. And my mind becomes narrower and narrower. And our society suffers as a result. If you think all of the great scientific, social, and political advancements that have been made by people who were out on the edge, who had the radical idea that maybe it was the moon, that moved around the sun rather than the other way around, that was a radical idea. And we don't want to create a climate where some 13-year-old girl is not thinking about an issue because her mom said that she may get into trouble if she reads that book. And that's what the issue is. Freedom is a very delicate thing. It's a very delicate thing between limiting people's intellectual growth or not. And that's why we have to be vigorous and extremely proud. If this flag means the Constitution of the United States, we as Americans should be very, very proud of that. And we should do everything that we can to fight those people who, for political reasons, are trying to limit basic freedoms in America.